Be that as it may, this is the second of 4 last lectures in a series. And my name is Patrick Hinely, and I want to start off by asking for a show of hands. I need to know how many of you believe in God. If you do, raise your hand. Okay. How many of you don't believe in God? Raise your hand. Oh, okay. So I issue the same challenge to all of you, which is to prove it. And I have to warn you, no matter what you say, I will still have my doubts. And I don't want you to get me wrong. I would love to be able to make that leap of faith which allows one to believe in an ordered universe watched over by a benevolent creator. And there are certain things that inspire feelings of that sort. For me, it's listening to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. But once the music stops, it's never very long before I start to wonder again. I've come to think of this as a kind of cosmic skepticism, and also that forms the basis of how I look at the human condition, which was perhaps most succinctly summed up by Hoagy Carmichael's tune title, How Little We Know. We, and I say we, but I mean me, just can't be sure. This is through no fault of our own, at least at the outset. I think when we're born, our cluelessness is benign. It's just the way things are. And I may not have the right answer, but an honest answer is never a wrong answer. And we humans don't have all the answers. In a lot of ways, I think we're just beginning to figure out some of the right questions. My favorite description of the limitations of human perception is found in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, a great American novel which, though it took him 23 years to write, also has the virtue of brevity. He was a master of what I have come to call the subtractive theory of creativity, a concept introduced to me by a brilliant musician named Steve Swallow. And in this scheme of things, everything that absolutely doesn't have to be included in a work gets left out. If you're not familiar with Vonnegut's work, I would triangulate him within equilateral spheres of influence emanating from Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, and H.L. Mencken, if you insist on that being all American writers. Or if not, then quadrangulate him, and on the fourth corner put the Frenchman Louis Ferdinand Céline. They're just master storytellers, vicious jokesters, and hilarious and profound all at once. Vonnegut's protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, is on display in a kind of zoo on the planet Tralfamadore, whose inhabitants have evolved further and differently than humans, and who perceive time in a non-linear fashion, while of course for us earthlings, including Billy, even all those light years from home, time can only be linear. The guide in the zoo is trying to explain this to the Tralfamadorian audience, because Billy has tried to and failed miserably and confused them horribly. The guide invited the crowd to imagine that they were looking across a desert at a mountain range on a day that was twinkling bright and clear. They could look at a peak or a bird or a cloud, at a stone right in front of them, or even down into a canyon behind them. But among them was this poor earthling, and his head was encased in a steel sphere which he could never take off. There was only one eye hole through which he could look, and welded to that eye hole were 6 feet of pipe. This was only the beginning of Billy's miseries in the metaphor. He was also strapped to a steel lattice which was bolted to a flat car on rails, and there was no way he could turn his head or touch the pipe. The far end of the pipe rested on a bipod, which was also bolted to the flat car. All Billy could see was a little dot at the end of the pipe. He didn't know he was on a flat car, didn't even know there was anything peculiar about his situation. The flat car sometimes crept, sometimes went extremely fast, often stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves, along straightaways. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, "That's life." So with all that in mind, let me embark upon this last lecture, my final presentation, a summation of a life I have, for the most part, very much enjoyed living. As Caesar with Gaul, it is all divided into three parts. First is an explanation of where I'm coming from. Then I want to talk about some things I've learned about the creative process in general and photography in particular, and then a few things I've learned about life, since there have been so few of those. This is all inextricably intertwined in a way that I cannot fit into either-or thinking. And in fact, either-or thinking is something I've come to consider one of the greatest shortcomings of Western thought. But for now, let me just encourage you to consider the possibility that an "and also" approach to life might be more universally useful, valid, and true. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, where my father worked as a passenger agent for the Seaboard Railroad, and my mother had two full-time jobs in the form of my sister and I. I took up photography in junior high school as a member of the yearbook staff. On the weekends in high school, I loaded and unloaded enough U.S. mail from rail cars and semi-trucks to be required to join the Brotherhood of Railway and Airline Clerks if I wanted to keep that job, which I very much did. I liked the money. And the raise I got for joining was far more than enough to pay my union dues. There were a bunch of us white high school kids whose dads worked for one railroad or another in those part-time jobs, but the regulars, the full-timers, were, to a man, African Americans of my parents' generation, and I learned many more useful lessons from those guys than from any of my high school teachers. I wish I'd photographed them. Too late now, but I can still conjure them up in memory and even hear the poetry of their voices if I am quiet enough, long enough. I lived in the same house until I came to Washington and Lee as a freshman in the fall of 1969. The late James Du Bois Farrer of Washington and Lee's class of 1949, director of admissions, told me some years later that I had been part of W&L's experiment in diversity at the time because I was a white boy from a public high school. I'm not making this up. Times changed, I graduated in 1973 with a major in journalism alongside such distinguished classmate majors as Brian Richardson, another recidivist to the alma mater. This was at the height of Watergate, and the total number of journalism majors nationally had increased far further than the number of entry-level jobs available. And the best offer I'd gotten was for $90 a week to research stories on Capitol Hill, which would appear in print under someone else's byline, if at all. My rent at the farmhouse I was sharing out in Rockbridge County alternated between $15 and $20 a month. Utilities totaled about the same. So I decided to stay here and see if I could support myself as a freelance photographer. I could, if not handsomely, but it sure was fun. After a year of freelance subsistence, part-time work as a photographer here at Washington and Lee became available, and there were two of us. You may have heard of my erstwhile colleague. Her name is Sally Mann. Within a couple of years, the winters were getting to me enough that I decided to return to my native Florida, and so I did for about 4 years, during which time I produced a program for public radio, delivered flowers, ran a pickup route for a medical lab, and continued freelancing as a photographer and writer, primarily for jazz-oriented music publications and record companies. None of that paid very well, but it sure was fun. During the 1980 portion of the 1979-1980 school year, I taught photography in the art department at Flagler College in St. Augustine, filling in for someone who was on maternity leave. As that term was drawing to a close, Sally called me up from the W&L darkroom and asked if I wanted to come back to work here, since she'd had enough. She was about to give birth to her second child and also launch into what has since proven to be a howlingly successful freelance career. I said yes and returned in the summer of 1980. I am still here. You would most likely know my work from the W&L calendar or our weekly Scene on Campus feature on the university's website, which I do in partnership with my colleague and fellow university photographer, Kevin Remington. If you're a reader of the Rockbridge Advocate, the local tabloid, you might have seen my community photojournalism in there, which has been featured since the paper's inception in 1992. It was founded by another journalism grad from back in the day, Doug Harwood. I have enjoyed much of my time laboring for the alma mater, as well as a sufficiently flexible arrangement to also be able to pursue about as much freelance work as I would want most of the time. I was married in Lee Chapel in 1983 and still am to the same woman, a patient saint. Our daughters were born in 1986 and 1990, and both are something my wife and I can never be: native Lexingtonians. They both have very creative minds of their own. Early in 2003, through the good offices of Larry Betch, class of '69, and Peter Cronin, class of '84, I was offered the opportunity to teach photography in the art department here at W&L to help get a new program up and running. I said yes, and did so for 3 years, during the last of which, 2005-2006, one of my students was a freshman from Argentina named Eduardo Ignacio Rodriguez. He arrived with some good photographic work he'd already done before coming to W&L, and did some more good work while he was in my courses. I thank him for that good work and for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you tonight. In hopes that the statute of limitations on it all is run out by now, there are a couple of things which can be told. First is that the last time I took an art course, I was in the 7th grade. And second is that many of my best students were not art majors. They were from the Commerce School or the so-called hard sciences, though I'm not aware of any sciences I would characterize as soft or easy, including the social ones. I found this noteworthy, but not really too surprising, because at its best, film-based photography, and that was all I taught, none of this digital stuff, which, even if they're not real photographs, are great for meeting deadlines, has always been an odd amalgam of the scientific and the creative, of the systematic and the intuitive, of calculation and inspiration, of craft and art. Much like journalism at its best combines the qualities of the timeless and the immediate, of literature and vernacular, the universal and the personal, and the poetic and just the facts, ma'am. So there's some more of that and also stuff. Either or is just too small a box for any of that. And taking up teaching again after 20-some years taught me a lot too. The first thing was a tough lesson on the elastic, though still linear, nature of time. Having committed in the spring to teaching 2 sections of beginners in the fall, I began to ponder the prospect of compressing more than 30 years worth of professional experience into 2 12-week courses with the priority of retaining and emphasizing those things which would be most useful and relevant to students whose context for this information might be non-existent at the outset. At best, it seemed like an impossibly tight fit. Then, on that first day of class, when I was actually standing at the lectern before a dozen attentive faces, attentive and expectant almost, and I'm plowing into my notes for the first lecture, within a few minutes, this sort of existential dread started to come over me when I realized, oh, holy shit, I've got to do this for an entire hour. And I couldn't decide which was worse, the torture for these innocent young people or just an insurmountable impossibility to this neophyte. I mean, it was like being in a Boone-Well film where you're on stage and you're supposed to talking and you have no voice. It was at that moment that I gained a much deeper respect for colleagues like Mike Pleva in chemistry, who's been teaching beginning labs here for 40 years and still sounds like he means it, still has plenty of his students get into med or grad school, still has a sense of humor, and still loves music. He's a lucky man, and W&L is lucky to have him and all of those like him. They are what make this place work. When I described my first day of teaching to a retired colleague who shall remain nameless, he told me that there were only 4 questions one need ask to judge success or failure, but all had to be answered no. Did anybody fall asleep? Did anybody get up and leave? Did anyone throw anything at you? Did anyone throw up? So I passed. It got better with each semester, and Eddie got the benefit of that by not arriving until my 3rd and final year. By that time, thanks to the experience of working with some other very talented students, and finally realizing I didn't have to reinvent the wheel for each new term as long as I kept emphasizing what's really important, I may have been starting to get a clue about what the most important thing we as humans can do with cameras is, and I think it is this, which is to make photographs of our loved ones. That's it. That's all there is to it. Because you never know when those will become historical, and none of us is getting any younger, unless Viagra or Botox is involved, and let's just don't go there. Seriously, in photography, no matter what your subject is, except that no one bats 1,000 and that there is no way to not take bad pictures. The good news being that the more pictures you take, the more likely you are to get a good one, though you'll also get more bad ones as well. This cannot be avoided, or if anyone knows how to, please tell me. I'll take your picture for the book cover. It's an all or nothing package, and every time you pick up a camera, you must sign for that package. But those bad pictures are not wasted efforts. They are a necessary part of the process. And the bad ones need to be studied just as assiduously as the good ones, so as to learn how not to do it that way again. In photography, progress can be defined as learning new mistakes to make. The same could be said about many things in life. Photography can be a very satisfying means of fulfilling one's own creative urges, but then so can basket weaving, cooking, or automobile repair, or any number of other things, almost all of which will result in products more useful than photographs. Within that limitation, though, I admit that I continue to feel something magical at work when I put an exposed but still blank sheet of photographic paper into the developer tray, and from nowhere an image appears. Once again, I've made something from nothing. I don't know why that fascinates me, but I'm thankful that at the age of 57 it still does. Very often this is all too immediately followed by the poker player's lament, who dealt this mess anyway. And every now and then, the image doesn't fall apart before my very eyes, but rather settles into coherence or even a logic and strength, all of it its own. And that's what makes all the rest of it worthwhile. And we all need something that does that for us. Photography is my path in that regard, but only one path. The need for some form of satisfying self-expression is universal. Or, as the folks at the Bread and Puppet Theater put it, art is food. You cannot eat it, but it feeds you. Looking back on more than 40 years worth of my own work, I find that most of what I've done that I'd ever want to look at again, and there's not a whole lot of it, is both documentary, with or without that intent, and creative, with or without success in the attempt to be so. And for years, I tried much too hard. I thought I had to make it happen. I now realize it's far more often better to just let it happen and to be ready to document the unfolding of whatever it is I'm witnessing from an interesting angle. There are usually many such angles from which to choose. Of course, that has to be done quickly. And I have learned that the dual action of closing one's mouth and opening one's eyes is conducive to more seeing as distinguished from merely looking, just as we hear more when we are listening than when we are speaking. In some ways, I think of myself as an incurable hunter-gatherer of souvenirs. Souvenirs of places I have been, of people I have met and known, of moments that struck my mind's eyes as relevant and meaningful observations on the human condition with life captured in the process of actually being lived. Photography of unmanipulated real-life situations remains, in my experience, the only visual art form that fully qualifies for Alexander Pope's combination of truth and beauty. And to me, this is photography practiced in its highest form. Trying to sort out what's created by the artist and what is documented by the photographer when the two are one and the same person is like trying to delineate between what is composed and what is improvised when you're listening to someone like Dave Brubeck or Ornette Coleman or any other master musician you would care to name who's using whatever written score may be in front of him as a starting point, but not as a rigid, limiting set of instructions. There is no line between the one and the other, so it is not either or, it is and also. This by now is probably becoming a theme. The first practitioner of this spontaneous kind of photography was a Frenchman named Jacques-Henri Lartigue a century ago, a child prodigy on a level in photography similar to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in music. He went on to become a fashion photographer and make a lot of money and lived a long and happy life, as did the man who is still the greatest master of that whole style, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who also spoke very succinctly about the process of being aware and prepared at that decisive moment, as he called it, when the eye, the mind, and the heart are all aligned along the same axis. So thus you have composition, some sense of narrative, and empathy. That's really plenty. It's all you need, except for correct exposure and accurate focus. And I think more than any other individual, Cartier-Bresson raised this style of working to a level of the poetic. He represents one of two directions that the roads take at what I consider to be the last significant fork in the road for photography, and this occurred in the 1930s. The other is best represented by Ansel Adams, Adams had a deep appreciation for the majesty of nature and a good eye for weather as well as composition. So, for all the allegations about his working methodology being completely dependent on pre-visualization, he could also completely change his plans if the sky behaved in an unexpected way and presented a scene different from what he'd already had in mind. Adams' technical perfectionism was legendary, and it shows beautifully. I mean, his prints look like something you can climb into. And this is as beautiful as anything Cartier-Bresson ever did. The difference between them being the majesty of nature on the one hand or sort of circumstantial surrealism on the other. Cartier-Bresson, they both really showed an openness to the moment, to the unexpected and unpredictable, in a word, to their surroundings. Just paying attention to what's going on around them. Any photographer who does not acknowledge working in the shadows of these two giants is either ignorant or arrogant. I find more joy in perusing their work than that of any of photography's lesser lights. It offers both inspiration and intimidation, factors I find far more motivating in a constructive way than fear and loathing. It has been my good fortune to travel many times to interesting places, and there has usually come a moment during each trip, and it seems to get earlier as time goes on rather than later in the trip. After something particularly wonderful has happened, usually involving the making of a photograph, I am certain, at the time anyway, will be worth looking at again, when I think that if I had to turn around and go home now, I could go home happy. Good trips, like good concerts, always seem to end too soon, and I've got a feeling life is going to be the same way. No matter when it ends, it'll be too soon. Which reminds me of something Florida State football coach Bobby Bowden said in one of those end-of-season press conferences a few years ago, while he was still in his 70s. A reporter implied that Bowden was so old that he really ought to retire so he could enjoy what time he had left. Bowden's response was that only the good Lord knows what quarter anybody's game is really in. He ain't telling, and that he was still on the field, which is a pretty good answer, I think. So I am glad to report that I'm still on the field, though I certainly defer to Bobby's seniority. And I haven't won a national championship yet. I have noticed, alas, as time goes on, that more and more of my favorite people are no longer among the living. To quote Vonnegut one more time, life is like a big train depot with people arriving and departing all the time. For instance, while I was trying to clean this whole thing up this morning, the phone rings. It's my sister from Florida calling to tell me that our Aunt Dorothy died last night. She was in her 80s, not well, had not been well, and of late had been in much pain. Her children, our cousins, are sad, but also glad that their mother is no longer in pain. So there's another and also. And I'll get in touch with them tomorrow and say I was sorry to hear the news, and that I hope things will go as well as things can go at a time like this. I just don't know what else to say. So I won't, and I'll try to be a good listener. I know I have much room for improvement in that regard. With age, one's own mortality becomes less of an abstraction, and the contemplating of it becomes more inevitable, no matter what distractions one might try to throw in the way of such thoughts. The hospice people, who, by the way, are all brave and unconditionally loving souls, talk about death as the last chapter in everyone's life story, as something more to be prepared for than to fear. This makes sense, especially since fearing death may well be the ultimate exercise in futility. Even within this gloom, I find optimistic thoughts are still possible. I'm reminded of something Pat Conroy has a character put into her suicide note to her husband just before jumping off a bridge, which was that he should live his own life to the fullest and shouldn't join her until the choice was not his own, but that when the time came, she would be waiting for him. I find this deep and bittersweet. It may or may not be a Southern thing. Conroy is a Citadel grad, after all, but it is certainly a human thing. The Hindu religion, which is older by far than Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, says death is okay. In fact, it says a lot of the suffering which human life often involves is okay too, because it's supposed to be that way. I first learned about this from a man who was stationed in India during World War II and later taught religion here at W&L, David Sprunt. May he rest in peace. In his Introduction to World Religions course, he told us about leaning on the railing of his ship early one morning while it was in an Indian port and seeing some rather fat cattle bathing themselves near the shore, not far from a bunch of skinny people, who of course would never eat the sacred cows, no matter how hungry they might be, and he said they looked pretty hungry. Being up about 4 stories, he could also see, inland from the docks, lush gardens and luxurious large houses, all walled off from the street. And on the street, he could see people living in squalor. But he then explained that in the Hindu scheme of things, that was okay too, because that's what's supposed to be happening. Everyone's where they're supposed to be, doing what they have to do. It's not quite that simple, but I find that line of thinking no less irrational or likely to be true than transubstantiation of the host. It's just the way it looks. There were other great teachers I had the benefit of studying under as a student here, though the profundity of their lessons took years or even decades to fully reveal itself to me. In that number, I would include all 3 members of the journalism department at the time, O.W. Regal, Pax Davis, and Ron McDonald. It is so odd to think that all of them are now gone. From the English department, which is all too appropriately housed in a building called Payne Hall, I gratefully salute Severin Duvall and the late Jim Boatwright, neither of whom let me get away with much, but acknowledged and rewarded my efforts on those rare occasions when the work I turned in was worth a damn. And then there were those whose courses I never took, but had the good fortune to get to know anyway, such as Yishang Zhu, professor and artist in residence emeritus, who retired from W&L 20 years ago and was also the founder of the Art Farm, a wonderful place now several years gone itself. About 35 years ago, he gave me the only book I have ever seen which is of any use in explaining how composition works in photography, which is a book I used in my own teaching. It is, of course, out of print. Mr. Zhu used to tell great stories while he was painting. I came to appreciate as well his preparations for the Chinese brush painting, which he had learned starting in his childhood, deep in the mainland of China, even unto the grinding of the ink, which had to be the first step. it was just like a musician tuning his instrument before playing it. It was getting, as they would have said in Cool Hand Luke, he was getting his mind right. And he did. Then there was the late Romulus T. Weatherman, director of publications and editor of the Alumni magazine, a loving and lovable child trapped in an adult's body who believed in my work before I did. Had it not been for Rom and working for him early on, I don't know what I would be doing for a living now, but I doubt it would involve cameras. And another member of the art department, the late Gerard Maurice Doyon, also known as Doodles, introduced me to art history, though I never took an art history course, by explaining to me why painters hated photography when it first came along. It was because painting portraits had been the bread and butter of most painters, and suddenly all that work disappeared. The camera had come along. So what did the painters do? Well, they turned to far more creative outlets, I think, and resulted in what we know as modern art. But before they got around to that, they denigrated and mightily insulted photography. Anyone can do it. It takes no skill. There's no art involved. It is totally dependent on technology, not creativity, yada, yada, yada. So I heard those words again years later, but it was my photographer colleagues saying the same sorts of things about this newfangled digital photography. And I have to admit to saying some of those things myself. Taking the longer view now, I think it can be said that in a way, what happened was that photography democratized art, and now digital photography has democratized photography. The monitor screen on the back of a digital camera is the biggest thing to come along in photography since 35 millimeter film, and that's been about 100 years ago with the first Leica. This isn't the last one, but it's not quite that old yet. I have to admit that that screen on the back of a digital camera takes a lot of the adventure out of the process of making images with a camera, but it removes even more of the stress when it's any sort of a once-in-a-lifetime image. And you could say that most images are once in a lifetime, or let me put it this way. The light's going to be different tomorrow. And also, in the bigger picture, so to speak, if there are images you want to make or things you want to do sooner or later, I'd say go ahead and start sooner rather than later, because it may be later than you think. Going back to Bobby Bowden, we don't know what quarter the game is in. But in tandem with that, also I'd give thought to something that the poet Nikki Giovanni told our law students some years ago, which has stuck with me. It's that she had never heard of anyone saying on their deathbed that they wished they'd spent more time at the office. Keep that in mind when you are compiling billable hours. I wish I had begun to do so sooner than I actually did. Getting there. If I've learned anything universally profound in this life, it would be that common sense and common decency are one in the same, the ultimate in and also. Do unto others as ye sow, so shall ye, and so on. Simple but true. In one form or another, all three of the major monotheistic faiths embrace this concept, though their followers have seldom practiced it upon one another for very long at a stretch. But then, our primary approach to religion has an unfortunately long history of being elitist and exclusionary, unto great violence and mayhem over the centuries. And this is not only wrong, on a planet that's shrinking as fast as ours, it's also just plain stupid. So I would like to propose that we redefine an oft-used and abused term and bring it up to date in a way that makes it more meaningfully inclusive. I decree that henceforth the Judeo-Christian ethic will be known as the Judeo-Christian Islamic ethic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I checked, there were some identical scriptures in the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. Since Gandhi is dead, we desperately need someone else like him in a similar position of global influence to shift the emphasis away from what divides us and focus on what we all hold in common, such as diminishing finite resources and an ever-growing population on a planet which too many of us treat like a strip mine. I hope this is something that President Obama might get around to working on. So far, he seems to be playing chess in a world where many are playing checkers, though even more seem to be engaged in a constant game of whack-a-mole. While he's at it, maybe he can fix the Israeli-Palestinian corrida. That's one I can't figure because nobody has clear title to the land. It is a deeply complex mess, but all sides on that same ground that so many faiths hold sacred might consider the words of a Californian from humble circumstances named Rodney King, who said, "Can't we all just get along?" I like to think we can, and am heartened to feel that our country is finally beginning, no matter how gradually, to move in that direction. Hope springs eternal, and may it always be so. There's much I've touched on in all this, but even more that I've left out, for which I apologize, as I thank you for your attention.